recording. Okay, so here's Saturn as Father Time, right? So Saturn is time. That's one of the first things that we'll talk about when we look at him. So this is why I chose the picture. Here's Saturn. We can see the hourglass. His foot is on the hourglass. Here's the sea, the side, or the sea, or however you want to call it. And that's a connection with Saturn. Shut the hell up, this damn fucking dog. And then that's a connection with Saturn as ruler of agriculture and cultivation of the land, and his connection to the fourth house. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit as well when we get there. And of course, Saturn is the things that frustrate us and piss us off. Well, anger, of course, is Mars's domain, but Saturn, frustration is Saturn's domain, and this fucking dog is frustrating me. And so there we have it. So we start now with the 2nd century, so Vettius Valens, and this is what and what we're gonna find, what we have been generally finding with both the houses and the planets, is that for about what would we say, maybe 900 years, almost 1,000 years, there tends to be quite a bit, or at least for 500 or 600 years, there tends to be quite a bit of continuity. And in some cases, there's continuity all the way up into the modern era. Now, what's happened with Saturn in the modern era is what's happened to the 6th house, the 12th house, Mars, all of these things, the 8th house, all of these connections, all of these houses or places that are connected with malefic energy have all been kind of, shall we say, I'm going to say airbrushed. They've all been kind of airbrushed and they've been kind of softened. But understand that Saturn is the greater malefic. He is the great malefic. And if you, for instance, if you take the traditional astrology course that's on the YouTube channel, when we talk about aspects, we talk about how each aspect has the character of a planet. And so the opposition has the character of Saturn. And so there's this aspect of obstacle, interminable lawsuit, subversion of business that's there. So humblings, sluggishness. So Saturn has always been connected with the lowest, with that which is the lowest. He tends to be the lowest caste. He tends to be beggars and people who are poor. So Jupiter, remembering that pretty much kind of Saturn and Jupiter are opposites. Jupiter is essentially the significator of wealth, right? And of benefit through wealth and through increase. Now Saturn is the significator of malefic energy through taking away and through lack and through obstacle and through sluggishness and through humbling, right? So Saturn is about humbling you, bringing you down low. Now this is where, once again, this is Saturn in traditional astrology. We're not psychologizing him. We're not talking about what he's like in the person's psychology. We're just getting an idea of who the planet actually is and what their domain, what's the furniture in their domain, what kind of tools do they use. So Saturn uses humbling. Saturn uses slowness, unemployment. So unemployment brings you to penury or to poverty. Obstacles in business. So Saturn uses an obstacle. Saturn slows things and delays things down. When we talk about things that are interminable, then Saturn, that's kind of a Saturn word though, but Saturn will then have a tendency to make things go longer and longer, to delay them. So there is the slowness, because remember, Saturn in this time period was considered the slowest planet, the furthest planet from the Earth and from the sun, right? Saturn is the principle of darkness because we're going to talk about this in a second with the next, in the next slide, because both of his signs, Capricorn and Aquarius, oppose the signs of the lights. Capricorn opposes Cancer, which is ruled by the moon. Aquarius opposes Leo, which is ruled by the sun. And so there we have Saturn as the dark and the cold and dark, which of course is also winter, which is the Saturn period. Secrets, imprisonment, right? Saturn's joy is the 12th house, which is the house of prison. Chains, okay? So here we come to the Saturn and the 12th house connection. imprisonment, chains, grief. Remember, they say that Saturn rejoices in lamentation, in wailings and lamentation, which are connected to the 12th house. Accusations, tears, bereavement. Accusations, we're going to come to, I do have a chart that I want to look at. It's a chart we've already looked at, but I do want to look at it again in the, what's the word I'm looking for, in the context of Saturn, and accusations comes up. So all of this is 12th house Saturn. 12th Saturn as ruler or kind of rejoicer in the 12th. Secrets, imprisonment, chains, griefs, accusation, tears, bereavement, capture, exposures of children. Now, when you exposed a child, that meant you left it out to the elements to die, right? So, and so of course, one of the myths connected to Saturn as Kronos is that he was afraid they were going to overthrow him, and so he ate them all once they were born. Okay, so the temperament of Saturn. So I get really into this idea of temperament and knowing how temperament translates into hot, cold, wet, dry, right? And so Saturn is a masculine diurnal planet. The diurnal planets are the Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn. Saturn is cold and dry, and the cold and dry is the melancholic temperament. So we also have cold and dry signs. The cold and dry signs are the earth signs. So Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn are cold and dry signs, and thus they are also melancholic in temperament. Saturn is the only planet who is thoroughly cold and dry. Mercury can also be a little bit cold and dry, but Saturn is the only one who's thoroughly of the melancholic temperament. Saturn is Vayutattva. So, you know, if you're working with me, I'm always talking about the connection between the planets, the elements, the chakras. And so Saturn is Vayutattva. Tattva is another term for element, which is the air element, right? Saturn is the father of air. Saturn and Rahu in Jyotish are the two air planets. Rahu is the co-ruler of Aquarius. And the Anahata chakra, or the fourth or heart chakra, is the chakra that is connected to the air element. And Saturn and Rahu abide within the Anahata chakra. Okay, so that's Vayutattva, air element is Saturn. And I've been reading about Vayutattva, and one of the things they talk about a lot is when air element rises, how difficult it is to stay in control of it. And so air, of course, connects to the mind and the mental working. And so there's also this idea about how difficult the mind is to control, how resistant people are to meditation because they just can't control their mind. That's Vayutattva, not being controlled. So I guess one of the positive aspects of Saturn as father of air is that Saturn represents control and limitation. And so through the discipline of Saturn, Vayutattva can be kept in check, or Vayutattva air element can be kept in check. Saturn is the author of solitariness, right, which is another connection with the 12th house, right, which is about isolation. And here we have his domiciles are Capricorn and Aquarius, and as I mentioned, they are both opposite to the signs that are owned by the lights, implying that Saturn represents the principle of darkness. Then also Saturn is exalted in Libra and in fall in Aries. Okay, so we now move from the 2nd century all the way now to maybe the 8th or 9th century. And so we kind of come, and with these, once we get into this medieval, this shall we say, Islamic medieval period and later, then things start really connecting together much more. Like Vedius Valens, you'll see some of the Vedius Valens things might not be as connected, but in this particular case they will, or you'll see new things that come up. And in this case, what you will see is some of the newer things that come up with the Islamic medieval period. So this is Abu Mashar. Saturn is malign, right? We've talked about him being the malefic, for he is cold and dry and melancholic. We've talked about that. Dim, stinking, and gluttonous. Now, one of the interesting things that you see with Saturn all the time is that he's bad smelling and dark and bad smelling. So where the dank smells are, where the bad smells are, there's Saturn. And, you know, I'm often talking about how the astrology is all around you. So think about when you are walking in a big city and you walk by, some 3-day-old urine. There, Saturn is there, right? You might be in a part of town that's kind of dirty and gross, and there's urine and urine smell. There's Saturn. So then we're in a Saturn environment. And so that's the way kind of to be thinking about how these planets can be manifested. Gluttonous, one of the things I've been seeing quite a bit here is that Saturnian type people need to eat a lot, but they tend to be very lean and skinny. Still of good association, activities involving moist things and waters and riverbanks. Now, this whole thing, we'll see this often too, this whole thing with Saturn and water, and is because Saturn represented the main way that international travel happened, and that was by boat, right? Because Saturn represents things that are big and heavy. So what you'll see is that Saturn is going to be connected to long distance travel in some of these, because and things that are dealing with the water, because boats, which are ruled by Saturn, are on the water, and they are big, huge, heavy things, and that they're represented by Saturn. Okay, so also though we know that with the fourth house as lands, we're always looking for a water source with land, and so waters and riverbanks. And there we go, and plowing and plants and works of the hands. And when he shows provisions, he shows much, and when he takes away, he takes away much. Okay, so there we have the whole connection. This is now, maybe we can say with the medieval period, we come now with Saturn being connected to the fourth house. Right, so far with the second century, we had Saturn's usual significations and his connection and his significations as the rejoicer in the 12th. But here we've got a different thing. All of a sudden we're talking about plowing and planting and working with the hands and waters and riverbanks, and that's all about topography and land. And that's ruled by the fourth house. And so that starts coming in now. And so when he shows provisions, he shows much, and when he takes away much, which makes sense. Greedy, a pilgrim and far away in cold places, cold, Saturn, having one thing in his mouth, but another in his heart. So the secretive way with Saturn, because once again, Saturn in 12th house and false friends, occupied in evil, right? So the sun, remember the sun is God, and sun rules Leo, and Saturn rules Aquarius. So the sun represents God, and Saturn would represent the things that are evil, that are against that, or that in this particular way. A traitor, a solitary, a forcer, a plunderer, torturer, jailer, but truth-telling, understanding. So now we moved into this kind of traitor, the secret traitor, and torturer, jailer, which goes with the 12th house. But now we come into Saturn as the ruler of things that are profound, truth-telling, understanding, making things old. Then we come into Saturn as the ruler of death, deadly, and inheritor. So there he is with his connection with the 8th house, chasing after old things. Remember that the 8th house is inheritances, but also ancient things. And then we come back to the 4th house of grandfathers and great-grandfathers and fathers, because remember the 4th house is essentially the house of the father. It's the house of the family of origin, which is usually found through the patrilineage, and full siblings born before the native and captives, occupied in knowledge, silent, and occupied in knowledge, silent. So there's the profundity aspect. Okay, so all of these little things, they seem like they don't seem to make any sense why they're together, but when we start to understand what Saturn represented, then we start to see why all of those things start to be listed off. This is another part of Abu Mashar. Therefore, the nature of Saturn is cold, dry, melancholic, dark, and of heavy harshness. We've heard all that before. Perhaps he will be cold and moist, heavy and of stinking odor. There is the stink. He is of much eating. There is the much eating thing in true esteem. And he signifies works of moisture and cultivation of land. Okay, so similar things as what we just saw. Peasants, right? Those are the poor people and village companions, and the settlement of lands. Okay, so back to the 4th house thing. Also buildings, 4th house, waters and rivers, 4th house, and the quantities or measures of things. And the division of the earth, 4th house, also affluence of multitude of assets. Now that could be second, but that also could be your patrimony, which is 4th house. and masteries which are done by hand, greed, and the greatest poverty and the poor. Once again, Saturn representing the poor. And he signifies travel by sea. We just talked about Saturn as ruler of boats, and foreign travel that is far away and at great length and bad. Right, because when you did these long distance travels, it was usually not a very enjoyable experience, right? It was usually an ordeal to do long distance travel. And, you know, if it wasn't the scurvy, the sickness, the whatever, you know, the yellow fever, whatever that could happen on these boats, you know, when you're going from one continent to another, certainly, you know, Saturn makes a lot of sense. And if we remember when we talked about the ninth house, we realized that the planet that represents pilgrimage is Mars. And it was specifically because of the dangers that could be experienced while on pilgrimage, right? And the difficulty of the difficulty in the journey and the dangers that could be experienced while you were doing it, right? So you had that as well. Okay, Al-Kabizi, Saturn is male, a bad one, diurnal. He's fathers. Okay, now we come into this fourth house thing. He's significator of fathers if the nativity were a night. And that tends to kind of sit for the next 500 years, right? So the significator for father by day is the sun. The significator for father by night is Saturn. And he signifies the last part of old age, of course. Saturn represents old age and death. If he were Western, and the beginning of old age if he were Eastern. So either way, it's old age. And so we'll look at a chart for the new people and talk about this stuff about Eastern or Western, which is another way of looking at it as Occidental versus Oriental. And he signifies the severity of cold and dryness. Okay, now we've skipped maybe 300 years, 400 years to Guido Bonatti to the 13th century. And Saturn is a masculine diurnal planet. We know that in temperate coldness, right? So he's not temperate. So it will be in temperate coldness you'll experience through Saturn and dryness, right? So in temperate coldness and dryness is frostbite. That's Saturn. That's how malefic Saturn could be, where you can lose a limb or you can lose a finger or a toe because the frostbite breaks it off. You know, it kills it. And his significator fathers and grandfathers, ancestors who are signified by the fourth, but this is more by accident by nature, and he naturally signifies the person or body of the native. What the hell is that all about? On account of the fact that the first thing which happens to a man is the person through which being is given to him. So we've talked about this. We talked about it with Mars and Jupiter as well. And what he's actually referring to is something called the Chaldean order. And the Chaldean order is essentially the order of the planets from slowest to fastest. And that would be Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. We'd only be looking at those seven. And basically, as I've said in my last few videos, instead of doing what we call the zodiac alphabet, which is Aries equals the first house, Taurus equals the second house, blah, 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 they use the Chaldean order so that Saturn represented the first house, Jupiter represented the second house, Mars represented the third house, the Sun represented the fourth house, Venus represented the fifth house, Mercury represented the sixth house, and the Moon represented the seventh. And so we'll talk about why. So Saturn represented the first house because Saturn is the principle of form. He is the form giver. And so essentially, Saturn works on the child in the womb and creates the form. So whatever form, physical form that you have, Saturn is responsible for it, because Saturn represents the principle of form itself. And Saturn acts on matter as form giver. So whatever you look like, whatever your body is about, on some level, Saturn is the progenitor or the creator of that form. Jupiter, right? So that's why Saturn is connected to the first. Jupiter is the ruler of wealth, which is why he's connected to the second. Mars is the natural significator of brothers, which is why he's connected to the third house, which is the house of siblings. The sun is the ruler of father by day, which is why he's connected to the fourth house. Venus is in her joy in the fifth. She's pleasures and amusements, which represents the fifth. Mercury is the ruler of servants, which is the sixth house, so representing the sixth. And then the moon is the natural significator for women, and that was represented by the seventh, because in this period, all of the people getting their charts done were men. So the spouse would invariably be a female. All right, so continuing, wait, that was Alcabisi, right? No, that was Benatti, and then continuing with Benatti, fathers, old things, burdensome things, right? Saturn is a burden, something laborious, because Saturn is labor. They have in light of his slow and burdened motion and his heaviness. So it's a heavy load. It's a heavy burden. It's Sisyphus. If you know the myth of Sisyphus, Sisyphus is the one that has to roll the boulder up the hill, and just as he gets it up the hill, it rolls back down, and he has to go back down and do it again, right? So that's the whole Sisyphus myth, is a Saturnian one, where you do this toil or this labor and to no avail, and even to no avail. That's the worst of Saturn. That's like the Saturnian ring of hell. Okay, but fathers, fourth house, old things, eighth house, burdensome things, 12th house, right? The 12th house is the house of labors. They have in light of his slow and burdened motion. All right. Saturnian, okay, so now we've kind of gone away from the general significations of Saturn, and we've gone into the type of person. So we're still not talking about, well, I mean, we're starting to get into the psychological aspect, petty, malignant. Now remember, Saturn is a malefic planet, which means that his influence is going to be malefic. So he might be, some of the things that we tend to see are cautious. Definitely there tends to be what we call taciturn, silent. They don't talk very much. There can also be a not wanting to be around people. There can be an antisocial aspect. So those are some of the more neutral aspects to the Saturnian matter. There can be also, remember, Saturn is responsibility and seriousness. Right? So at the same time as he's depression and pessimism, he's also responsibility and seriousness and discipline. So those are some of the positive aspects of the manner. But petty, malignant, careworn, right? Because Saturn is the worrier, self-deprecating or depreciating, solitary, there's the antisocial aspect, deceitful. Once again, this aspect of Saturn being silent, or you're plotting in silence. Secretive in their trickery, strict, okay? Saturn is not lenient to liberal. Downcast, Saturn is conservative. Downcast, so he's not uplifting, right? Saturn can be depressive with a hypocritical air, squalid. Now here we get into the whole poverty and dirt. Squalid, black-clad, importunate, sad looking because of the melancholy, miserable because of the melancholy. The nautical bent, back to boats and plying the waterside trades. We're going to start here, and cleverness. And cleverness, envy, and wits, and seduction. So once again, this falseness of Saturn, boldness and dangers and impediment. Now that's in the positive, right? And hesitation and being singular. So the hesitation we definitely see being singular. We can often that comes as a result of not wanting to be around many people. And a scarcity of association with men. Boom. And pride and magnanimity and bluffing and bragging and the subjection of men. Now that's on the other side of Saturn, right? That's the negative side. Also the manager, so that's the micromanager that you work for in retail. And magnanimity and bluffing and bragging, we already said this. And also the managers of a kingdom, right? And of every work which comes to be with force and with evil. So then we have tyrants and injuries and a tendency to anger, right? So we've got repressions, we've got fascism, we've got tyrannies, right? So those are all under Saturn. And a tendency to anger, blah, blah, blah. Also truth, and now we come back to the profundity aspect, truth in words and esteem and prudence and understanding and experience. And now we come back to the not so getting along with everybody, and offense and obstinacy and a multitude of thoughts and a depth of counsel. Now we come back to profundity and insistence and stubbornness in his method. Now remember that Saturn rules the fixed air sign. So the stubbornness and method, that makes a lot of sense for fixed air. He does not easily get angry, and if he were angry, he would not be able to rule his own mind. Now, remember Saturn, I talked about anger is not his domain, that's Mars's domain. What we tend to see instead is frustration, right? Depression and frustration with Saturn. He wishes good to no one, and so then we can get into this wishing no one well, right? Jupiter is the one who wishes good on everybody. Saturn would wish ill. And he signifies old men and weighty men and burdens and fears and griefs and sorrow and the complications of the mind, right? Saturn is what is heavy, what weighs us down. And fraud and affliction and difficulty and loss, right? And so Saturn is the bringing us low once again. Also ancestors and what is left behind by the dead. There's the 8th house connection and the ancestors for the 4th house connection. Mourning and being orphaned and old things. So all of this kind of wailings and lamentation, 12th, 8th, 4th, we're seeing it all with Saturn. Even grandfathers and men who are blamed and robbers and those who dig up graves, right? So Saturn, the 4th house is the place of the grave, and who rob the garments of the dead. So that's low as it gets. Right, that's as low as it gets. When you're digging up graves and robbing garments from the dead, you're as low as it gets. And fitters of leather, and now that's because the tanning, where the tanning places were usually smelled really bad. So anything that had to do with tanning, tanning and leather work usually smelled horrible. He signifies magicians and masters of discord. Now that's interesting. And low-class men and eunuchs. Now, of course, it could be black magicians, right? And he signifies a great length of thought and a scarcity of speaking and the knowledge of secrets, and one does not know him what is in his mind, nor does a wise person make disclosures to him about every obscure matter. And he signifies austerity and the ascetics of religion. That's important too, this austerity, the seriousness, the austerity, the silence. If you've ever been to an ashram, there are some, or if you've ever been a part of a Hindu cult, which I have, it's not for very long, thankfully. It was an extremely austere cult, extremely ascetic, no sex, very little enjoyment of any kind, no garlic or onions, certainly no meat, but no garlic or onions either. So that's what they call the sattvic diet. But it was really, really, really strict. So that strictness is Saturn. You were supposed to think only on the things connected to the ashram, that kind of single focus. What do they say? What is the not swerving in their method? That's an aspect of Saturn. So a lot of these, there are a lot of especially Hindu, Eastern yogic things, connections can be extremely Saturnian, but cults generally can be extremely Saturnian because they control all aspects of your daily activity and thinking. All right, so Al-Kabizi, if you were made fortunate, true esteem, taking time. So this issue of true esteem we've seen more than once, and that's probably because of the responsibility and seriousness. Right, so Saturn takes responsibility and is dead serious about what it is he's doing. And if he were bad, he will be obstinate, unstable, and sad and grieving. And we see again when Saturn isn't as negative, he's obstinate, right? So when someone is obstinate, that means they're unswerving in this contrary way. So this fixity, once again, comes up with Saturn. Unstable and sad and grieving, a bad suspicion, suspecting much, provoking men with whispers. And if you were fortunate, once again, so many different things we're kind of seeing. This is kind of why I love doing this, is because my issue with modern astrology is that since everything is focused in the mind, we don't really get to see what the true personalities of the planets are and what they really themselves represent. And so here, when we separate this idea of what Saturn, how he manifests as your behavior, then we get to see what the actual Saturnine behavior is, and how Saturn operates, and what that means for you when, let's say, you have Capricorn rising or Aquarius rising, or Saturn in the first house, or Moon in Capricorn or Aquarius, or Moon Saturn, right? So now we start to begin to see that, oh wait, when we're talking Saturnine manner, we're talking about how it's going to affect me personally. And so this obstinacy, yes, I can see that. You know, I have Moon Saturn, or I have my chart ruler conjunct Saturn. And yes, I can see that. Right? So that's how we start to look at it when we start bringing it into charts. If you were fortunate. And also, though, we can see Saturn as just the bringer, the nemesis, right? He's also called nemesis, right? So he can bring things, how he can bring us low, right? So when we look at a few charts, we'll look at this. If he were bad, he signifies low-class property, what? Bringing us low, once again. But also, fortunate, he's ancient and lasting things, real estate and the cultivation of land, 4th house, 8th house, dirty waters, those with bad taste, old and changeable, right? So once again, if he's in bad shape, then we're poor, we're dirty, we're stinky, right? We're unsavory. Saturn is the unsavory. And so, here we come to Bonatti. So severity of intemperate cold and dryness. So that term severity, right? We look at austerity, ascetic, severe, there's Saturn. Melancholy, there's Saturn, right? So that's why he's been softened over the last 50 years, because he's not any fucking fun. And that's a really important thing, is that Saturn is not about fun, right? He's not about enjoyment and fun and lightness and mirth and laughter. He's not about those things. He's about, go to your room and study for your exam. You've got that big, huge exam, and how well have you studied? Do you know all 300 questions? You know the answer to all 300 questions? There's going to be a math portion. There's going to be a language portion. There's going to be a blah, blah, blah portion, a science portion. Are you ready for all of that? Did you take responsibility? That's Saturn too, right? So you can't have fun. Now, you can't go out and drink. You can't go to the bar. That's the 5th house. That's Venus's joy. That's Venus. Right? She's intoxication and intoxicants. You can't go and do that. That's fun. That's her domain. You've got to study. You've got to sit. Now, study, of course, that's Mercury too, right? But you've got to take responsibility for the tests that you have coming up that you have to pass if you want to get this certain thing. And so there we have Saturn as the bringer of responsibility, of severity, of seriousness, right? Complexion of bodies, melancholy. Perhaps the melancholy will be a mixture of phlegm and with slowness and heaviness of limbs. So once again, this issue of heaviness and slowness, so that he will not be light and gait. Also, you'll find that the Saturnian type, right, it's cold and dry. Often you'll find that sometimes when Saturn is representative of the communication, it's a dry delivery, right? So people who are deadpan, who are funny as hell, but they're totally deadpan. They never react, and they always get these dry ass zingers, and they never make an expression. But everybody else is pissing their pants. That's the Saturn humor. That's the Saturn way of being funny. Or the other Saturn way of being funny is seeing the bad in everything. Everything is going to fuck up. Like taking it that direction. Of course, that's just the Saturn killjoy, right? So stinking and bad odor. Man undertook to esteem someone, he will esteem. This issue of esteem comes back up. And like, once again, it's because of the seriousness with which he takes matters. He will hate him with an extreme hatred, hardly or never desist from that hatred, right? So that's once again the obstinacy or the fixity of good condition, profoundness of knowledge, and good and deep counsel, such that another will hardly or never know how to improve it. And then Lily, profound in imagination, there's the profundity, in his acts severe. There's the severity and strictness, in words reserved. There's the taciturnity, in speaking and giving very spare, same thing. In labor, patience. So Saturn is also patience, and also labor. In arguing or disputing, grave, right? Saturn is heavy and grave. In obtaining the goods of this life, studious and solicitous. There is the study for the test. And in all manners of our action, austere. Right, so we're not talking about fun. So one of the other issues I've got with modern astrology is they try to make everything into everything, and they try to make Saturn into a party boy. And Saturn is no fucking party boy. He is a killjoy. Saturn is when I used to live in San Francisco, you would meet people out and you'd hang out with them and you'd like them, or you'd work with them and you'd like them a lot, and then maybe you would invite them to go with you to a party. And that was when you really got to see what they were like. And sometimes you got a person who could totally hang. Sometimes you got a person who hung a little too well and drank a little too much, a little bit too much into the senses. Sometimes you've got a person though who was extremely awkward, clung to you the whole time, or stayed away from you and sat by themselves in a corner the whole time. That's the Saturn person at the party. Right, so Saturn, the person that couldn't have a good time, that couldn't meet, couldn't really talk to anybody, or you found them talking to the only person that everybody else hated, or so that's, once again, that's like the Saturn aspect. Anyway, mashallah, so Saturn signifies with the, okay, so now we're on to the body. So black and saffron, so this whole thing with coloring we ignore. Walks, merges his eyes to the ground. Remember, there's the downtrodden aspect to Saturn. Heavy. Walks, he joins his feet together, holds them curved, having small eyes, dry skin. Remember, Saturn is dry, having a beard sparse and whiskers, thick lips, clever, ingenious, a seducer, a killer, and especially secretly. Once again, this idea of killing in secret, or of plotting in secret. Man, very hairy in body with joined eyebrows. And most parts of his body more cold and dry, of a middle stature, complexion male, a pale, swarthy, or muddy, his eyes little and black. Once again, these tiny, kind of little beady eyes looking downward. Once again, a broad forehead, black or sad hair. Now we're in the 17th century with Lily, so we've gotten to the modern era. And it's hard or rugged, great ears, because Saturn represented hearing and ear and the inside of the ears, hanging, lowering eyebrows, thick lips and nose. Okay, so we see that again, a lumpish, unpleasant countenance, either holding his head forward or stooping. So Venus is beauty, then Saturn was ugliness. And so lean, spare, knees and feet indecent, many times shoveling or hitting one against another. So a shuffling nature, heavy gait, shuffling nature, right? So think, when you all walk by a person, a beggar or a homeless person, that's Saturn. Think about that. Think about, well, I'm thinking about like the homeless people I see in the United States. Almost always there's a big bushy beard. Often they're very skinny. Often they're skinny, always dirty. Often there's a bad smell. So the homeless person, the beggar, is Saturn. So for instance, if you're doing some kind of Saturn, let's say, you've got Saturn in Aries or something and you want to do a Saturn charity, then you would feed the homeless, or you would give money to the homeless, right? You should give $3 to the homeless, or $9 to the homeless for 3 weeks or for 9 weeks, right? So that would be your Saturn charity, is that you would do it. So ultimately, looks like a general way to remediate Saturn is to help the homeless, is to feed the homeless, right? Is to be around the people, is to be of service to the stinky, the dirty, the downtrodden, right? So that's already a way of doing that, of remediating your Saturn. So if you've already got a Saturn problem, then that's a way to kind of deal with that Saturn problem and make your own Saturn better. Now we move on to the professions. Serfs, and so the peasants and the farmers, so the people on the lowest on the totem pole. And also because it rules over the land and it causes men to be renters of property, tax farmers, and violent in action. It also can put into hands great rank and distinguished positions because Saturn represents the government. Supervisions, management of others' property, and the fathership of others' children, right? Because Saturn represents fathers and ancestors. Management of property, there's the 8th house. Of others' property, there's the 8th house. Management of estate. It signifies faraway foreign travels, right? We were just talking about that because of the ships. Prison and fetters, there's the 12th house. Also labor and delay, 12th house, and there's also Saturn himself. Affliction and inheritance, so there's the 8th. Even fathers and grandfathers and older brothers, there's the 4th. Eunuchs and slaves, eunuch doesn't have the sexual capacity, so their ardor has been chilled. Slaves and low-class men, there's Saturn in the 12th and the 6th. And of works, he signifies the works of leather. Remember we talked about the tanner and how badly it smelled, and how badly the leather workers usually smelled. If he were the sole significator without the complexion of some one of the planets, he signifies the work of a common laborer. So you can also get a person who's a laborer. And so profession signifies ancient things, laborious things, aquatic works, right? So we talked about that. Those which take place near water, mills, bridges, ships, and the like, and the bringing forth of waters and the cultivation of the earth. If however he were unfortunate, old and low-class things, working with hoes, the digging of base pits. So when you see the ditch diggers, the trash guy, anybody working, I mean, you know, in India, you know, you have the guy that basically clears the tracks of the shit, and you know, he comes and he does that, and so like that's a Saturn profession. Carrying of stone and cement to walls by the neck, so even masonry, it looks like, can fall under Saturn, and especially to underground walls, or those of the cities and which are next to pits, and making of many things out of which come to be a brick and the like. So labor and construction. And often such people live in labor and distress and poverty, and they eat bad and stinking food. So once again, this idea of things that are bad, things that are low class, things that are poor in quality, things that are smelly. Also, Saturn is connected to Jews. So it's connected to Judaism, to Jews, and look, it's basically connected to Abrahamism, right? Because Abraham is a patriarch, and Saturn represents all patriarchs, right? And Abraham is usually shown as usually shown as a older man with a long white beard, right? There's a Saturn, and of course Moors, even though Muhammad is even though he's the prophet, they all use the Jews and Christians and the Islamites all use the same. Much of the same scripture, and their holy places all in Jerusalem. Farmers, stonecutters, masons, right? Potters, tanners, sower workers. We got to it. The dregs of humanity. It looks like we're all on it. People. This is 16th century. People who are tenacious, very hardworking, greedy, jealous, lean, beardless, solitary, sorrowful, taciturn, voracious, deceivers, or treasurers. Huh. Now, treasurers. That's an anti-Semitic trolling, because if you remember, during this period, the Catholic Church had a very, very strong sanction against usury. Usury is basically, it's charging money at interest. And there was you could not do that until the 19th century. The Catholic Church was absolutely against it. And I think there's also strong rules in Islam as well. Only the Jews would do that. So often the Jews would be treasurers, and they'd be bankers and treasurers, etc., because they would charge money at interest. So this whole thing about treasurers, that's, like I said, a little anti-Semitic slight there. And now we're on with Lily, couriers, night farmers, miners under the ground, all right, because Saturn would represent the same as the fourth, which is things under the ground. Tinners, potters, broommen, plumbers, brickmakers. So all of these low-class jobs, maltsters, chimney sweeper. Think how black the chimney sweep gets, right? Saturn's color is black. Sextons of churches, bearers of dead corpses, right? Because Saturn rules the dead and the grave. And there's the fourth house. Scavengers, hostlers, colliers, carters, gardeners, ditchers, chandlers, dyers of black cloth, and herdsman, shepherd, or cowkeeper. So nowadays, when we think about maybe a Saturnian job, we think of working for the government. So if you're working, a government job is a Saturn job. Although Sun also has connections with government, but it has, with the kingdom, right? But Saturn is the workings of government. I also often call it the social contract. It's the working of the collective, and how we work collectively as a social body, right? That's how Saturn is ruler of Aquarius. Saturn body parts, valence. Of the limbs of the body. So it rules the legs, the knees, right? Because Saturn rules Aquarius, which rules the legs. Saturn rules Capricorn, which rules the knees. The tendons, the lymph, the phlegm, the bladder, the kidneys, and the internal hidden organs. Okay, so this is 2nd century, so we'll see how it's changed. Kabdal-Kabizi, inner part of the ear, that wasn't there, and the spleen. Now that's something you'll see for 700, 800 years, starting with the Islamic period. And the spleen and the stomach. And of colors, he has blackness, which we know, and of taste, the harsh and the acidic, and of days, Saturday. All right, so, but inner parts of the ear, the spleen, and the stomach, says Kabizi. Banati says that Abu Bakr said Interior of the ear, the spleen, and the stomach. That sounds like Abu Bakr and Al-Kabizi are probably writing around the same time. This is almost the exact same thing. And of colors, he has black, of taste, the astringent and the acidic, of days, the Saturday, and of nights, that which precedes Wednesday. And parts of the body. Now, here's Saunders, Anthony Saunders, who is 17th century, and this actually comes from a book where all he talks about is astrological physics, or astrological or medical astrology. And so the right ear, the spleen, the bladder, the paunch, the bones, the middle finger, and the teeth. Notice that he didn't bring the stomach in, and now he brings instead the bladder in. The paunch, the bones, and that's something we do connect generally with Saturn, and the teeth we now generally connect with Saturn. But the bones, the teeth, the spleen traditionally was, and it was because the spleen was considered the seat of melancholy. The seat of melancholy was the spleen, and that's why Saturn represented it. So injuries arising from cold and moisture. So now we're into the infirmities. Cold and moisture such as dropsy, neuralgia, gout, cough, dysentery, hernia, and spasms. I just thought I would add this other part. Possession of homosexuality and depravity. So anything that was an aberration from normalcy, and perceived as a what shall we say, an extreme aberration from normalcy in this 2nd century was under Saturn. I think that's fascinating. Al-Kabizi, phlegmatic and congealed melancholic diseases like leprosy and cancer. So cancer is a Saturn disease. Morphine and gout and the rest of this kind. Gout is another one of those things. And so now coming to Benatti, epilepsy and the falling sickness. So that usually falls under moon. Signifies phlegmatic, once again, in melancholic diseases. Phlegm is like, you know, hawking up loogies and things of that nature. Melancholic diseases are depression. But melancholic is, but also this things that have to do with coldness. Diseases of freezing up, hard ones, earthy ones, and locking up. So cramps and locking up of joints and things of that nature would be arthritis. Also would be, and arthritis would also fall under this. Signifies diseases which are not cured, like leprosy, white morphew, deep fistulas, and in places of nerves and other like illnesses. Signifies that these diseases will happen to the native if Saturn were the significator, and he were of such a condition, in such question of infirmities, he will often signify such illnesses. And then Schörner, now coming back to parts of the body, ear, right ear, spleen. Schörner is after Benatti, but before Lilly. Right ear, spleen, bladder, bones, and their infirmities. Okay, so this is after Benatti, and Benatti just said all of these things: right ear, spleen, bladder, bones, and their infirmities. Carton fevers, all diseases of a cold, dry nature. We saw that. Leprosy, cancers, elephantiasis, disorders relating to the black bile, right? Because black color is Saturn. Rheumatism, which is arthritis, wasting disease, ethica, colic, tenesm, black jaundice, tremors, melancholy, palsy, dissolving of the stomach. There's a stomach issue, right? So coming back to that. And Lily, right ear, teeth, bringing the teeth back in. The carotenoids come back. Proceeding of cold and dry melancholy distempers comes back. Leprosies and rheums, that's arthritis. Consumptions and black jaundice, palsies, tremblings, vain fears, fantasies, dropsy. So vain fears and fantasies, isn't that interesting? So worries, right? We've seen that Saturn is represented from worry. And gout, which I think is fascinating. Apoplexy, dog hunger, and too much flux of the hemorrhoids. So dysentery is too much flux of the hemorrhoids. Ruptures if in Scorpio or Leo in any ill aspect with Venus. And then the what's the word we're looking for him, for Saunders? Saunders is the expert. Let's see, author of such as Pursuit of Melancholy, the carotenoids, black jaundices, obstructions of the spleen, deafness. So remember, he's the inside of the ear. Madness proceeding of melancholy. So there's the madness that comes from depression. Palsy, swimming in the head, ringings and noise in the ears. Anorexia, isn't that interesting? Hyposarca, or is that hyposarca or sarca? Gouts, pitifis, crudities and flux. Okay, acute diseases. disease from superabundance of phlegm, crude humors, surfeit stuffing of the pipes with phlegm, toughness of the stomach, latitude, so weariness in the limbs, earth and teeth, so ear and teeth problems, leprosies, rheums, consumptions. Okay, so it's all pretty much, this is the most, it looks like the Schoner and this one are the most, are the most kind of detailed, but all kind of in there. I think that's it. Oh, and then I was going to, from there, look at, we would just kind of look at a few of the other things, and then we'll look at a few, at a chart or two. Okay, so we were looking at illnesses. We already saw that part with Lily. And then this is a picture of, oh, here are the savors, the flavors: sour, bitter, sharp. In man's body, he principally rules the spleen. Now, we realize now the spleen doesn't do very much, but like I said, at one time it was considered the seat of the emotions, or the seat of melancholy. Bear's foot, starwort, wolfbane, hemlock. Hemlock, that makes sense. Henbane, that makes sense. Mandrake, poppy, nightshade, dragon, pulse, parsnip, right? And so there are some of the things here. Nightshade, shepherd's purse, so I forgot about that one. And then under, let's see, we've got the plants and trees. We've got senna. Now, senna kind of does if you do senna, it will like move your stomach, it'll give you diarrhea. So that's kind of a, what's the word I'm looking for? It creates a dysentery, but I forget what the word I'm looking for is. Polypody, willow or sallow tree, yew tree, cypress tree, hemp. I wonder if hemp meaning weed. It might be just the hemp part of weed, not the marijuana. Ass, cat, hare, mouse, mole, elephant, bear, dog, wolf, basilisk, crocodile, scorpion, toad, serpent, adder, hog, all manner of creeping creatures, breeding of petrification, either in the earth, water, or ruins of houses. Makes sense. The eel, tortoise, shellfishes, the bat, or bottom feeder, shellfishes, the bat or blue black crow, lapwing. The crow is Saturn's vehicle in Hindu astrology, in Hinduism. Owl, gnat, crane, the places he delights in: deserts, woods, obscure valleys, caves, dens, holes, mountains, or where men have been buried, churchyards, and ruinous buildings, coal mines, sinks, dirty or stinking muddy places, wells, and houses of offices. And he rules lead, the leadstone, the dross of all metals, right? The dross of the rubbish, the trash, and also the dust and rubbish of everything. All right, so Saturn is the dirt. Saturn is dust. One of the things I wanted to look at was Saturn as connected to just being a malefic planet generally. And so last week, or 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, when we looked at Mars, or a month ago when we looked at Mars in traditional astrology, I used this chart. This is the chart of Alfred Dreyfus, or Dreyfus. And Alfred Dreyfus is the subject of something called the Dreyfus Affair, which happened in the late 1890s in France. Alfred Dreyfus was one of the few officers in a particular branch of the army who was Jewish, and he was accused, and he was basically arrested for treason. He was arrested for selling secrets of artillery. He worked in artillery, or secrets of artillery, to the Germans. And but he was wrongly accused. It turned out that it was a noble person, and this became a huge national affair. It became so huge that even Emile Zola, who was one of the well-known authors of that time period, wrote a scathing editorial in the newspaper called J'accuse, and it created this huge stir. And there were two different huge factions that were anti-Dreyfus and pro-Dreyfus. It turned out that he was completely exonerated in 1906. But he was sent to French Guiana. For 5 years he lived in exile on an island. So this man paid for accusations. He paid for accusations. So one of the things that we just saw was that Saturn represented accusations. And so when we look at a chart, one of the things that we look at is we're looking at, now this is a whole sign chart. I meant to have an auspicious chart, but I don't really care for this. But one of the things that we look at is we remember what Bonatti says in his fourth consideration. There are 16 things to look at first. And the very first thing you look at is what planets are in a state of advancement and what planets are in a state of retreat. So a state of advancement is when a planet is in an angle or succeedent house. The angles are the first, the fourth, the seventh, the 10th. The succeedent houses are the second, the fifth, the eighth, the 11th. And a planet is in a state of retreat if it is in the third, sixth, ninth, or 12th. So in this chart, this is the first house. So we've got Rahu, we've got the North Node in, advancing. The fourth house here, we've got Pluto advancing. But what I really want to come to is this one here. In the seventh house, we've got Saturn advancing. And Saturn is Saturn is pretty much the only planet who is the only classical planet who is in an angle, who's in an angular placement. Now, you'll notice that the midheaven here is Sagittarius, and so that means that Scorpio is not the 10th house necessarily. The midheaven, which would be the 10th house, would actually be Sagittarius, but that doesn't matter because there's nothing in either Scorpio or Sagittarius. But we do have this Saturn in the 7th here. And the Saturn is the ruler of both the first house, so that's the person themselves, and the 12th house, which is the house of one self-undoing, but it's also the house of hidden enemies, right? Okay, so thank you so much for letting me know that. And okay, so what I was saying was that when we're looking at enemies in a chart, what's happened is that the 7th house has become known as the house of open enemies, right? So that becomes the house of your open enemies. And that's because the 7th house opposes the first house. The 7th is the other, the first house is you. The 7th is your marriage, right? The first house is you. What do they say? Everything is fair in love and war. The 7th house is your opponent. The first house is you. The 7th house is the salesperson. The first house is you. Okay, so that's why the 7th house can take on all of those different aspects. The 7th house is that which you are chasing. The first house is you, right? So we've got open enemies for the 7th. We've got hidden enemies for the 12th. Now, before, there wasn't really a distinction. The 7th house was the house of contention, right? So if there was a contention or a lawsuit or something like that, then that's a type of enmity that shows up in kind of a formal way, in a formal opposition. But as far as somebody who was your enemy, often your enemy manifested as a false friend, someone who was false. And so that's connected to that was connected to the 12th house and hidden enemies. However, the 6th house, if we go back to the Hellenistic period, the 6th house was connected to enemies generally. So to enmity in general, and to servitude, and to slavery, and to remember, it's called bad fortune. So we've got the 6th, the 7th, and the 12th house to look at when we're looking at when we're looking at enmity. One of the first things that I recognize is that the ruler of the first, right, it's the Aquarius rising chart, is in the 7th, which is the house of open enemies. Also, that the ruler of the first house is also the ruler of the 12th, which represents your hidden enemies, right? Which represents those that those might be speaking against you that you don't know. Also, remember, we just talked about how Saturn represents accusations. Now, the next thing is when we hear about rumors, right? Because it was a rumor that released, well, it wasn't a rumor, it was a piece of paper that was found by a housekeeper in a trash can. And she brought it to the head of the army. And so when we are looking at rumors, like generally in a horary, like if somebody is asking, is the rumor true? Or should I take this advice? Or is that rumor true? Then the rumor is the third house. And note here how the Mars, the ruler of the third, is opposing the moon in this chart. And notice that from the part of fortune, the moon is the ruler of the ascendant, and Mars is in the third from the part of fortune, opposing the ruler of the part of fortune. So we've got that connection of the third and of this scandal that happens as a result of some kind of difficult, or as some kind of a possible what's the word I'm looking for? I keep wanting to say resume. Not reaction, not resume. It is a rumor. But what I was really looking at initially was this idea of this Saturn. And one of the things about Dreyfus was he was a man of few words, very, very serious, very, very serious person, very intelligent, very serious, very meticulous, very rather severe person. And so it makes perfect sense. So here we can see Saturn working in a bunch of different ways. We can see Saturn showing the nature of the person. We can see Saturn in the house of the open enemies. We can see Saturn representing the 12th house and also the hidden enemies as well. Coming back here for a second, I thought I would. Oh, so we looked at this last week. We looked at Zsa Zsa Gabor. And one of the reasons we looked at Zsa Zsa Gabor was because she was married 9 times. So in my opinion, that would mean there's something wrong. Somebody who's married 9 times, there's something wrong with them, in my opinion, right? And usually it would mean that there's something kind of fucked up about them as a person, right? They might be really hard to get along with. They might be actually quite difficult to get along with, or they have difficulty staying with one person. You know, they easily bored, or it could be a variety of factors. But you know, one of the things about Saturn is, you know, we've been seeing this term obstinacy, obstinate, right? We've been seeing fixity. So Saturn should represent stability, right? So Saturn should represent stability. But in this chart, this person has a problem staying married. Okay, so this problem has a marriage issue. This person, now, I mean, it's like a quirk of the person, right? That they've been married so many times, but it's really, it's a neuroses, right? It's a pathology of sorts. So let's see if Saturn has any involvement in it. First of all, we see that Mercury is the ruler of the ascendant. So Virgo is rising, Mercury is the ruler of the ascendant. Mercury's in Capricorn. What do we know about Capricorn? Capricorn is a licentious sign. The licentious signs are Aries, Taurus, Leo, Capricorn, and then I include Scorpio and Libra and the water signs. But the traditional licentious signs or signs of frequent coitus are Aries, Taurus, Leo, in some Libra, some not, and Capricorn. Okay, so we've got, excuse me, Mercury is in a licentious sign. Mercury is with Venus. So usually with Mercury, Venus, we see a performer. right? We see a performer of some sort, dancer, singer, actor, one of those things. And sure enough, she was a dancer, singer, actor, right? But then what we also see is that it's in a sign ruled by Saturn. And then we also see that Saturn is opposing, Mercury is applying to the opposition of Saturn. Mercury is applying to the opposition of Saturn. Venus, Mercury is also applying to the conjunction of Venus. Venus has just separated from the opposition to Saturn. Oh, by the way, let's talk a second about West versus East for the people who are new. And generally, for the people who are new, if you need to ask a question, please feel free. This is a good time now. If there's any questions, if there's anything, I mean, I've talked a lot of shit, but if there's any stuff that you want me to clear up or whatever, this is the time to do it, and I can use charts to do it. So feel free to write any questions you have in the chart, but let's talk about Oriental, Eastern, Occidental, Western. The sun is the focal point, generally. A planet that is oriental of the sun is in an earlier degree of the zodiac than the sun. So here the sun is at 17 degrees of Aquarius. Any planet that is within 150 degrees, let's say about 150 degrees of the sun before it, could be considered to be oriental. So that means definitely the moon, the Venus, the Mercury, the Venus, the Rahu, and we could say technically the moon. Both of the charts show Saturn conjunct the South Node. How does South Node affect the expression of stuff? That's a good question. I'm not using it necessarily per se. I don't really want to make a. I'll make a more of a general comment about K2, the South Node, than I will make a specific. Generally, when we see with K2, there is either with Rahu or K2, both, it's a smear of sorts that happens to the planet. If you notice that it was, the last one, it was what, Saturn, it was Saturn in Leo with K2. This one is Saturn in Cancer with K2. This one's even worse because it's Saturn in his detriment with K2. So the rule is that any planet with the head or tail is usually made malefic. And K2 has a tendency rather to create a malaise that makes us want to turn away from that thing. So K2, Rahu, the North Node, is the mouth of the dragon. So the mythology about Rahu Ketu is that it was a demon that drank, that they were churning the ocean to get this thing called the Amrita, which is the nectar of immortality. And the serpent demon got in there and drank some of it, and they cut it in half, but it was too late. It had already drank it, so it didn't die. And so the mouth part of the dragon is Rahu, the North Node, and the tail part of the dragon is Ketu, the South Node. And so Rahu has to, they both, remember that Rahu and Ketu can both eclipse the lights. So they both have to deal with taking us away from that which is seen. And so Rahu has to deal with the underworld and crime and stuff of that nature, also ghosts. And then Ketu is what we call moksha karaka. And so moksha is where we renounce the world and turn away from it in order to break the cycle of birth and death, of death and rebirth, rather. Thus, Ketu's function is to create a malaise, is to create a disillusionment. And that's interesting that you asked about it, because look at how, first of all, Mercury's with Ketu, with Rahu, but Saturn's with Ketu. And remember, doing like we just did, where we looked at the part of fortune as the ascendant, Mercury becomes the ruler of the seventh house. And so we've got now that Saturn Ketu opposing the Mercury. Also, we've got the Venus moving away from the Saturn Ketu. So we would know that anything having to do with Saturn would also have to do with a disillusionment, a malaise, a I'm not. There's something about it that makes. There's just something about it that makes this not really. Or something about it that I was enjoying it, but I'm not enjoying it any longer. So that's what I'm going to say about Saturn with K2 in this particular case. But we can put that Saturn K2, notice that Saturn is the ruler of the 5th house, which is the house of enjoyment, and the 6th house, which is the house of ill fortune. So that means that the Mercury, who is the ruler of the ascendant, but also the ruler of the 7th from the part of fortune, is opposing it, is applying to the opposition, right? So, and it's pushing nature at Saturn, right? Because Mercury is in Capricorn, which is Saturn's sign. So it's going to give Saturn kind of back to himself. Saturn as ruler of the 5th has a difficulty enjoying things, or enjoys things that other people don't, right? So Saturn as ruler of the 5th often is the planet, is the one that likes to read the really hard, heavy manuals that no one else enjoys reading, or going through microfiche in the library that no one else wants to, right? Or into any kind of, or into Coptic, into in Coptic or hieroglyphics or something. It's things that are difficult, it's things that are hard, but it can also mean, in this particular case, because we're talking about somebody who's really a codependent, it can mean that the Mercury Venus, the Venus is in her joy there. This person's trying to have a good time. This person's trying to enjoy themselves, but it's being opposed by Saturn. I like it. I thought I liked it. I thought I was having fun, but it's not really fun. And things that I think are fun, it starts as fun and then it's not fun anymore. You're not fun anymore. You probably, I bet that if we got to know about Jaja, we would hear that she would often say to her husbands right before, "You're not fun anymore. You're no fun anymore." But Jaja couldn't have any fun. Jaja couldn't really have fun because Saturn rules it, and Saturn's with K2, and K2's disillusioned by the fun. So that means I've got to do it again. That means, and so Rahu can often be this unusual need, right, that we have to fulfill. And so with Venus there too, that can mean I have to do it again. And notice also how the Venus, who's the natural lady of marriage, so she's the ruler of marriage, is squaring the Jupiter, who's the ruler of the 7th house. Her next application is to the Jupiter, and Jupiter is the ruler of the part of fortune. So we already know that a major part of this person's life is going to be partnerships and marriage, right? And then we see Venus and Jupiter connected, but we see that Venus is giving Jupiter his fall, and Jupiter is giving Venus her detriment. It's not really useful. Then also, those of you who've been with me for a while, you know that I call Venus Jupiter too much of a good thing. And I almost always say, when I see Venus Jupiter, what part of their life is out of control? And I usually look to see the sign Pisces, because Jupiter is the ruler of Pisces, and Venus is the exaltation ruler of Pisces. And so when they're connected, it's usually a too much of a good thing type thing, and their life is out of control because of it. Boom. Pisces. So in this particular case, we've got Saturn showing up as a malefic planet in how, also Saturn shows up as malefic ruler of the 5th house in that she never had any natural children, if I'm not mistaken. She married men with children, but she herself never had any children. So we can see, also remembering that the 5th house is the house of children, and Saturn either in the house or ruling the house can often be a problem. Moving on, anybody have any questions from there? And you can ask about anything we've talked about so far. You can ask about other things as well. No, nobody, nothing.
Come on, someone's got to have something. I want to look at here. I want to look at Judy Garland, because this is another chart. It's a chart. Sometimes a person's life is so interesting that their chart. It's the case with Alfred Dreyfus. Alfred Dreyfus has this amazing biography. I mean, he was publicly denounced, arrested, humiliated, and the subject of this humongous social movement, kind of like George Floyd became, and then fully exonerated later. That's an amazing biography. On the world stage, the Dreyfus affair, it's still this huge. As a matter of fact, we were talking about it this morning in the Jyotish room, and one of the astrologers was like, "Oh, I'm a history person, and I remember reading about this in history." So he when I said, he's like, "Oh, Frenchman," he's like, "Yeah, I remember reading about the Dreyfus affair." So this is a huge important. As a matter of fact, it's so important that it actually, within the seeds of the Dreyfus affair, because of the anti-Semitism involved, within the seeds of it are the beginnings of the Israel state, the Zionist state for Jews in Israel, because it's as a result of the Dreyfus affair that Jews that were in power at the time decided that there was a need for a homeland, and that they needed a place where they could go and not be persecuted. And so that's where the whole beginnings of the Zionist outcry for a homeland, for a Jewish homeland, it starts with the Dreyfus affair. So this is why with some of the people that I choose, it's because of their biography that I choose it. And so with Judy Garland, it's similar. Here we have somebody who was one of the most famous people in the world, and who was a hopeless drug addict. And a pauper who lived very, very, very wealthy, but who really never had any control of her own money, and also had almost no money. Also a person married 5 times. So here's a person for whom there are malefic aspects happening to their life. There were malefic aspects happening in their work life. There were malefic aspects happening with her parents, with her mother, losing her father, with her mother. There's malefic aspects happening all throughout the professional life, and also with marriage. So what malefic aspect is it that we're looking at? We're looking at disruption. We're mostly looking at, it feels like kind of Mars disruption, but Saturn must be in there too somehow, right? And certainly what we're going to see, one of the things that we have seen is that she was married 5 times, and in almost every case, except for maybe 1 or 2, there was quite a disparity of age. Judy Garland married Vincente Minnelli, Liza Minnelli's father, and he was almost 20 years older than she. When she married Sid Luft, he was 10 to 15 years older than she. She married Mickey What's-His-Face. He was 22 years younger than she, right? So there's this case of age disparity. And sure enough, look, we've got Saturn ruling the 7th house. And we've got Saturn ruling the 7th house. Saturn can be problems in marriage, right? Saturn can be delay in marriage. It can be difficulties in marriage. We just saw it can also be older partners. We just saw with what Jaja, she was married 9 times, and she had that Pisces on the 7th cusp, and which makes quite a bit of sense as far as I'm concerned, and all of that kind of stuff. But at the same time, we've got another person who was married all the time, another codependent, another person whose life was out of control, and we're not going to have the same kind of signatures. So the first thing that we see is that Saturn is in the 7th. I mean, that Capricorn is on the cusp of the 7th. The part of fortune is in the 7th. And then that Saturn is exalted in the 10th house from the part of fortune. And Saturn is with Jupiter. So this is a symbol of high rank or this is one of the things, like if you see something like this, where the ruler of the part of fortune, or especially the ruler of the part of spirit, is 10 houses away from the part of fortune. See how you have that? Capricorn, Saturn here is 10 houses away, 10 signs away from the part of fortune. Saturn is also exalted and he's with the benefic. That should take somebody to the top of their profession. That, no question, that should take somebody to the top of their profession. The ruler of the part of fortune is in the 10th house. It's either in its own domicile or exalted, and it's with the benefic planet. You can pretty much say if they're not going to be famous, they're going to be damn close. They're going to be at the very, very height of their own profession, right? So they might not be the most famous person in their profession, but they will be top. So definitely we've got that. That also, if we remember also correctly, that the part of fortune is the main significator for what? Substance in a chart. Now, we just talked about how this person had no money or lost money or had no control over their money. Now, but that doesn't mean that this person didn't earn exorbitant amounts of money. Right? So as far as substance is concerned, this person earned a shit ton of money, right? Saturn in Libra with Jupiter. She brought in a lot of money. Whether she could hold it or not is a different issue. And from that, we would maybe look at the ruler of the second house, right? So the second house is Leo, the cusp of the second is Leo. And here we've got this Sun opposing Mars, and the Mars is not just is it opposing Mars, but the Mars is retrograde. So we can see, and we talked about this when we've talked about substance, is the difference between seeing what the person brings in and seeing what the person holds on to. And that looks like that's pretty much the thing. We get to see either by the part of substance or the part of fortune, how much the person's bringing in. And then the ruler of the second shows what the actual karma with the money is. And certainly in this case, we've got Sun and Mars. Both of those planets are hot and dry planets, so cholera. So that would be surprises, unpleasant surprises. That would be arguments and contentions. That would be words. We came to blows. We came to words over it. You know, she was constantly in arguments over money, humiliations over money. There were humiliations involved over money as well when her husband sold her contract for $1. Because remember, this person was highly erratic. Judy Garland was highly erratic in behavior, and the drugs made her even more so, right? And you can see also, look here, Cancer rising. We know that Cancer rising is one of the most sensitive. It's the human weather vane. It's one of the most sensitive of the rising signs. And then the moon is at 2910 Sagittarius, and Mercury is once again retrograde at 0 degrees 8 of Cancer. The moon is applying to the opposition of Mercury. So even though they're out of sign, Mercury and moon are opposing each other. And so that's, remember, moon is the non-rational mind, Mercury is the rational mind. So already we've got a problem. This person's mental thinking, this person's thinking, that's a problem. Now, is Saturn involved in that? Yeah, it kind of is, isn't he? Because both of them are applying to the square of Saturn. Well, Mercury is moving away from the square of Saturn, and then the moon is applying to the square of Saturn. Right, once she gets into Capricorn, she'll be applying to it. So Saturn is involved. So this is a person, we can see from this that this is the kind of person who fame destroyed. You got cut off right when I was talking about Mercury retrograde. I love it. Right. So this is the kind of person that fame destroyed. Right. It's a square connection to the ruler of the ascendant and to the Mercury. Who remember when those of you who haven't been with me for a while, we always look to the moon and Mercury as the primary significators of soul. right? And so they're the first level of the significators for soul. And so already we've got the moon and the Mercury connected to by square to the ruler of the part of fortune, which says, there's going to be challenges in connection, but we can also see that this person's mental state wasn't really stable enough to handle where this took them. And with the Rahu there as well, all of the whatever, the weirdness of Hollywood or the non-traditionalism of Hollywood. And remember, it started really young. I think she was 15, 16 when they started giving her pills to wake up and then giving her pills to go to sleep. And that's how that's how she became a speed freak. That's how she became a drug addict. So, but we can already see that there's an instability mentally. And so more than likely, this person may have been self-medicating because they were so at odds with themselves on the mental plane. Excuse me. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share there. Look, we've come to